Hi there, Simon Hobbs from FreeSource. In the last couple of videos, we've been creating a script that can pull data out of Airtable that we can use in a lookup list. In this video, I want to do two things. I want to just restructure the code a little bit so that so it's easier to kind of reuse, and I want to add a little bit of caching around the call to Airtable so that we don't hit any service limits on our account. I have an initial code.js file here from when I started the project, and I'm going to separate this out a little bit. I'll leave this code.js as it is. I'm going to create a script called Airtable. So in this Airtable script, what I'm going to do is add an Airtable class. In the constructor for this class, let's allow whoever's calling this class to pass in an API key, and we'll leave it there for the moment. And this means that whoever's calling the class needs to have their own API key, and the class isn't responsible for that security. When that class is created, let's assign the API key to a property. Now, since we've already written this code, I'm going to take you through the final solution because it simply involves basic restructuring of the code. Our original code had a doSumProcess function, so we still have a doSumProcess function. We also have this line of code which gets the current token, and we've added these two variables, base and table, to define the Airtable base and table. To make the call to Airtable, we're instantiating this a new class, instantiating an object of the Airtable class, and we're calling that AT, passing in the token to do that, and then we call the function on that class, get table records, passing in the base and the table. The rest of the code is the same as it was previously. We loop over the results and we build up this products lookup object. So let's have a look at this code. This is the Airtable class. The three functions that have been added are get table records, fetch all results, and fetch response. So the fetch response is simply calling Airtable. You give it an endpoint. It doesn't care what that endpoint is. It will add the correct headers to that, the correct HTTP options to that, fetches it, knows, gets the JSON from the result, from the response, and returns the JSON. The fetch all results is the paging method, and so it wants a page size of 100. It makes the call to that fetch response, that new fetch response function, and it checks to see if there's the offset in the response, and if there is, it continues to call that endpoint until it gets all of the results. So this function is the one that knows how to build an endpoint in order to get the results, because it needs to take into consideration paging. It's still a very simple example. Should be fairly easy to understand what's going on there. And then the method that is expected to be called from a calling code is this get table records. And this underscore doesn't make the method private or the function private, but it does indicate that these are typically called internally. And how you structure your class, you may have a different design. But in this example, we want the external code to call get table records, pass a base, pass a table, and then it will do the rest, build up the initial endpoint, get all the results, and return the results to the caller. So let's just test that code and see if everything's still working. So we should get a dump of the products object, and then a dump of a specific product and the name of that product. Great. Okay, now what we're going to do is add some caching around our calls to Airtable. There's a consideration here about where you want to add the caching. I know where I don't want to add the caching, and that would be around the fetch response. I want to keep this relatively generic and not add too much complexity to it. And the other thing I note is that a good cache key would be the initial endpoint for a table. Now, that wouldn't be a good cache key if I was calling that endpoint in different ways from different places, but for this example, I'm only ever calling this endpoint uniquely for one purpose, and that is to get all of the data and put it into an object. So I'm going to add some caching in here within this method. So what I want first is I want to grab a cache service object. I can choose get document cache or get script cache for the two options. I wouldn't use get user cache. It would require asking the user for more permissions. I don't need to. Get script cache is perfectly fine for this. And then in the initial call, I want to let the caller decide if they want to get cached results. So I'm going to add a parameter called cache seconds, and I'm going to make this by default, around about 24 hours, more or less. That's in seconds. So that's probably going to be about 23 hours. So the first piece, the first conditional that I will apply. Right, the first condition I want to check for is does the user actually want to use cache data? So I can say, if cache seconds is greater than 0, then let's assume yes, they do want to check the cache. So if they do want to check the cache, let's get some cache data. So cache object, I'm going to call it. The cache object and we'll call cache.get, and we'll pass in the endpoint. And the endpoint can be up to 250 characters, so we should have no problems passing in a URL as the endpoint. So let's say we've got that object and we want to check and see if there's actually anything in it. So look, if the cache object is equal to null, or is not equal to null, I should say, then let's return the data. And at this point, we haven't had to go back to the API. And then after that, we can then make the call. So get the response, work out the paging, results, offset, get a call URL, call it, loop over, and so on, until we get to the point where we've got some results. So if if nothing has been passed in, so again, if cache seconds is greater than 0, then we'll allow this data to be cached. So let's create a toCache object and stringify Now, it's important to note that this results, in order for something to be cacheable, this actual data must be no more than 100 kilobytes. So we're going to actually test. So if toCache.length is greater than 100 1,000 bytes, then we really probably want to say something about this to the user. So we're just gonna log. This does not have to break the code. However, we haven't been able to cache the data, and that's important for okay, so we're going to log that. So we can't do anything with that data. We're not going to be able to cache that data. However, if it is less, we can go cache.put, and the cache name is the endpoint, and the data to cache is to cache, and the cache seconds. Okay. What we'll also do is we'll just put a log, at least just for now, into this to say console.log successfully cached Okay, let's give this a test. Here we can see successfully cached the data, and then we have the results. Just as an extra step, let's just see how much data we are caching at the moment. So let's grab this this cache length, the cached. So because we're caching this for 24 hours, if we want to force our script to ignore the cache and to save new records, say something went wrong or we just want to test it, we just have to make it skip this first section. So if I just add false here, so that'll evaluate to false. So it won't try and load what's in there, what's already in the cache, but it will still try to save it. So let's give that a go. Okay, so it's saying it's successfully cached only 402 bytes for the endpoint, and that's great. And then, so that's success. So this, in theory, this is what's been cached. So what we should be able to do is double check that we're actually getting that data back from the cache. Console.log loaded loaded from the cache. And remove the false. All right, let's give this a test. Okay, so the outcome here is that we can store this data for 24 hours at a time. And if we add more data into Airtable, yes, there's a question there of this script is not gonna dynamically clear that data, and that's sort of beyond this script. It would eventually clear after 24 hours, but the upside is that our limit in terms of how many times we can hit the API in a month for Airtable on the free plan, by doing things like this, we can stay well within that limit. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.